So, Professor Anderson, I'm so happy to have this chance to engage in conversation with you about your work. To folks who are watching this video, Professor Cheryl Anderson is a lawyer and a scholar and professor of Old Testament Hebrew Bible at Garrett Evangelical Seminary in Evanston, Illinois. And she's done extensive work on legal theory, intersectional identities, and other topics, applying these insights to advanced biblical study. And so, she's published several books and a number of articles, including a 2004 book, Women, Ideology, and Violence, Critical Theory and the Construction of Gender, a 2009 book on ancient laws and contemporary controversies, the need for inclusive biblical interpretation, and is currently involved in working on her next book, Crying Out to the Lord, Womanist Reflections on Biblical Interpretation in the Era of HIV/AIDS, which we've talked about in a separate video more. In this particular conversation, I actually want to start with a part of your 2009 book, Advocating for a More Inclusive Biblical Interpretation, where you pretty forcefully and persuasively argue for a form of interpretation that unmasks supposedly objective readers of the Bible as interested, active interpreters, and incorporates the perspectives of the marginalized majority. And so if we could start with that, because you linked back to some debates that are happening within legal studies between advocates of an interpretation of the Constitution who are looking for an originalist interpretation versus people who view the Constitution as a living document. And it might be helpful for folks to hear some about how biblical studies can exclude and oppress through its equivalent of an originalist interpretation of the Constitution.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a complicated question. Yes, I found in both my legal circles and in biblical studies, there was this assumption that the tradition should always go back to what the founding fathers said in legal terms, or to what the Bible says in church circles. And that can be deeply problematic, especially when as the world has actually become smaller and we're interacting with more people who are different from the ones we might have grown up with, when we understand how global dynamics occur. We have had to become more aware of how these readings, these traditional readings, whether of the Constitution or of the Bible, have excluded people and excluded their realities. I mean, it's not just that they didn't listen to their voices, they didn't take into account the realities that surround them. And to start with the Constitution first, I mean, I was struck when my mother and I took my nephew, her grandson, and a little friend of his to Washington, D.C. And we happened to go to look at the Declaration of Independence. And it was at that time that I saw in one of the exhibits that at the time of the first presidential election in the United States, only about 6% of the population could vote. And that just struck me. You had to be, basically a white male and a property owner. So you had to be privileged in order to vote. And I was struck by that because it means that for all of the rest of us, we have a struggle to vote in this country. And of course, now that, I mean, as you said, that book was published in 2009, but we have to really realize that it's in our DNA to exclude people. Even though we have all of these documents that talk about us being a democracy and so forth, we have this almost natural tendency as a nation to exclude. With the Bible, whether it's in academic studies or in the church, we're told that there's only one way to read these texts. And it's always viewed as either objective or divine. It either comes from God or it's these objective scholars. And as I tell my students, it's not that, especially when these early methods were developing, it wasn't so much that they were objective, it's just that they all looked alike. And from their context, there were certain questions that never would have come up. I still don't understand how a text like Sodom and Gomorrah or Judges 19 could be considered anti-homosexuality texts when they're about gang rape, number one, and where they never ever critiqued the fact that the women are being, that basically these texts are saying that it's better to rape a woman than a man. I mean, I don't get that. I mean, to me, that's not being objective. That's just not being one who would ever be subjected to that. So it doesn't concern you. It's not your concern. So what I've wanted to do in my work is to say, look, we have to take these different realities into account, whether it's of the US Constitution or the Bible, either in the church or in academia. We have to realize that that these texts are powerful. The Constitution and the Bible are powerful texts. And yet they can be misused if you don't have them in discussion with some other realities. And that's the ongoing struggle in both of these arenas, to make them more diverse, to make them more inclusive, and to not have people say, well, I'm sorry you're hurt by this biblical text, but it's just what the Bible says. No, it's not what the Bible says. It's your reading of the Bible that's causing the harm. And we need to read the Bible differently. So I hope I got at that. It's kind of hard because it seems like you're comparing apples and oranges, but to me, the Bible and the Constitution both function in similar ways. Yeah.
No, I think that analogy is really interesting and powerful because, as you say, both texts are very powerful in the culture, and at the same time, how one decides to read them and making clear it's a decision is really crucial. I want to turn to a specific example of some of what I think you're talking about in terms of looking at sort of a multidimensional view of biblical study. It's an article that I often have my students read as an example, sort of the direction a sort of multidimensional, critical, historical, intersectional reading of the Bible might go. And it's called Reflections in an Interethnic Racial Era on Interethnic Racial Marriage in Ezra, which appears in the volume They Were All Together in One Place. And so I just wanted to hear some more specifics about how your work on legal theory and intersecting identities in the Bible led you to this topic and illustrate some of what we're talking about.
Right. I was struck by the fact that it's been less, what is it? It's 50 years that interracial marriage has been legal in the United States, the Loving versus Virginia case. And so to me, that's not ancient history. That's really part of our contemporary era. And yet, I love the language of Ezra 9. I mean, it's just such a dramatic text. And he comes in and he just sat appalled. I just love the language. But I realized that in a conventional reading, a traditional reading of that text, we're led to believe this is a good thing, that these foreign wives and children are being sent away and that these marriages aren't going to be allowed. But what does it mean for African Americans, many of whom, like myself, remember an earlier era? What does it mean for us to have to read that text and think that it's a good thing? I just thought that it requires us to ignore an important history. It calls us to not be aware of how those dynamics are still playing out in the society around us. I just was struck by that contrast, our history and the way they're to read it as people of faith, just that. So I used critical race theory, which I was familiar with from my legal days. And in my first book, I used critical legal theory to analyze biblical laws. So I was familiar with that. I was familiar with the concept of intersectionality. And what I found fascinating as I was writing the article is that I could identify those same dynamics in the era of Ezra. That's what was fascinating to me, is that there was enough work published on it that I could reconstruct race, class, and gender in the era of Ezra, and then show what the parallels were for the anti-miscegenation, context for the laws in the United States. Exactly the same. The fact that I could parallel that was just fascinating. So it meant that there really is a way of looking at these texts that we haven't done, and yet when you're trained to be a biblical scholar, you can do it. It's just that in this case, for me, it just took a Black woman who objected to anti-miscegenation laws to say, wait a minute, this isn't a good thing for us to read these texts as if they are. It's harmful, it's destructive of a community to do that. And that's what we learned before the 1960s in the US. So it brought together both the ancient context and the contemporary context. And I think it helped set me up for because I think this was published before the second book was. And that second book is about how these unresolved issues in it's particularly biblical laws and some narratives then show up in the contemporary issues that we have today. They never get resolved. And this was a good lead-in to thinking about that again as I was working on the second book.
Well, that's fascinating. And it kind of connects to my last question, which is you mentioned ancient context and contemporary context and these multiple layers. And you've been trained, in so-called traditional biblical methods. And at the same time, you're a leader in incorporating other methods that are all too often excluded or marginalized within the Guild. And so I wanted to close by asking you what you saw as sort of the outlook for diverse methodologies in biblical study. What kind of place might there still be, if there is one, for historical critical methodologies in a methodological mix that's more inclusive? And also just anticipating, because we've talked a little before this, how your thoughts about this have changed some over the recent past, how you'd answer this question.
Right. Yeah. it's interesting because I remember, to answer this question, I have to remind you of something you said to me years ago. And that is, we were at one of the many receptions at an SBL annual meeting, and you told me that you use this article. And you said that one of the questions you asked your students was if this was a historical critical analysis. And I just loved that question because I thought, I don't think of myself as a historical critical scholar. And it was like, how did he see that in that text? But that's exactly what it is in the first part of the article. And I think if you had asked me 5 years ago about, historical critical methods, I'd go, I don't deal with those. I mean, it's something I had to learn in grad school, but I don't do that. But what I have come to see is that liberationist perspectives, Asian American, African American interpretation, Latina, all of it, I think of those as hermeneutics. They're perspectives that we come to the text with. And then we have a whole range of methodologies that we might use for our analysis. We might use historical critical methods. We might use literary methods. For instance, in the womanist literature as it's developing, very often a biblical scholar might go back to the 19th century preaching women and look at themes about how they use the Bible in sermons. So there are a lot of different methods that can be used, but I think that what marks us is the liberationist perspective that we come with and that we then open up the text in a different way. So what I've come to appreciate more, and again, I'm kind of surprised I'm saying this, but I actually do default to some historical critical analysis because even when you look at something like JEDP, what that shows is that these are in fact interested texts. Even though, of course, we have to say now P and non-P and all of that. But still, it shows when you have the DTRH tradition, when you have that, being reworked in chronicles, if to have, the whole act consequence logic and Proverbs then responded to in Ecclesiastes. You have, what I'm seeing is that the historical critical method, when you realize that basically these are interested documents that are talking about things usually that way out of time, because they're written much later and they're projecting back on things. That is exactly what I want to be able to show, because it's showing that these are in fact political texts in the sense that we think of politics today. They weren't objective texts. I mean, it's so hard for students to hear in an intro course, that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch. But I keep telling students, look, learn about what we do think, how we think this Bible came to be and what that means. It shows you the dynamism of the tradition. One tradition didn't say, well, Mark described a gospel, so we don't need to do it. Each gospel then, was presenting Jesus in a different way for a different community. And we see the same kind of reworking of texts for different communities in the Hebrew Bible. And so it's funny, but I actually spend a lot more time teaching basic historical critical information than I ever thought I would. I just taught Exodus, and I had some PhD students in the class. And so we went through a critical analysis of Exodus, and the students and I loved it because it was just... So I've got to say that I've really come to appreciate just classical historical critical methods, but just because they show how the Bible was written, and they show that there were very interested human beings who were doing this. I just have to give you one story. I was interviewed recently about my work on LGBTQ plus inclusion. And I was saying that even if you debunk the clobber passages, which it's very easy to do, so that they don't say what people think they say, that the afterlife of bad readings continue forever. And I was giving the example of the curse of Ham. Mm-hmm. And it's to use a historical critical analysis, it's not even a sophisticated one, to see that text comes, first of all, is the curse is not from God, number one. And then it's not Ham who is actually cursed, it's Canaan. And there's a reason why it's Canaan, and it's because they want the land. It's just it's so even though that text has been misused in the African-American context to support slavery and continuing discrimination, part of the problem is that we never dealt with the fact that this was an interested text to begin with. And so, yes, it could be abused by somebody, because that was part of what is behind the text itself. So it's just interesting how, looking back at these traditions and how they got shaped and what their interests were, I think it will help us sort of not only read these texts with caution, as we should, because they have been so mishandled, but also to see that some of these dynamics are embedded in the text themselves. And unless we call them out, they're too easily used. And I think that the worst consequences of many biblical texts were not in antiquity, they're now, because we don't know how to analyze them more fully and look at the interests behind them. So anyway, that's my evolution, to sort of come around to historical critical methods. And I never thought I would.
Well, I wonder, and I let me check to see if this would fit your own self-perception, but some of what I've thought about as I've read your article and reread it, as I've taught it with students, is that all too often, I think, historical criticism, as it's been traditionally practiced, is quite selective in how much it views the situatedness. It's okay with situating biblical texts as interested, as you say, but it doesn't recognize how interested the historical critical interpreters themselves are, or the various readers of these texts over time.
That's right.
And so it's sort of a very partial historical criticism. It's historical criticism only for other people, in the sense. And what I think I see in your article is an attempt to be more thoroughgoing in terms of being historically critical of, yeah, okay, we're going to look at the ancient context and some of what we think was going on there. Mm-hmm. Then let's look at some of the very interested, partial, harmful ways people have read it over time in the meantime, and then critically interrogate the way we decide to use these texts now, and be historically critical about ourselves and that. And that would be like, maybe it's taking this term historical critical and applying it too broadly, but mm-hmm. I think it points to the problem. And so anyway, that's how if one was to use the term historical critical in the positive way, right, for what I see going on in your article, that's what I'd say one might do.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's really true. I think when you were describing this definition of historical criticism, I was reminded of Gail Yee's presidential address almost 2 years ago now. And to me, when I listened to her that evening, I was thinking, she's doing what historical criticism should have done all along. and yet it's bringing the ideology of the text, the socioeconomic dynamics of the context to bear. And to me, it was like, yeah, this is what it should have been doing. So you're absolutely right. It was a partial analysis before. And I think that as we have more biblical scholars of color and others who are more interested in opening up, these other conversations, to begin to see that, yes, actually, you can begin to do this from a historical critical framework, but you've got to redefine. Coming out of grad school, it was like, I do not care what was going on in ancient Israel. I just didn't want to work on that. But I do want to know enough to understand what is the context of these texts. Yeah, I do want to know that. Yeah, so it's just kind of interesting that I wouldn't have answered that question in the same way. So yeah, I've kind of grown into it.
Well, that's so great. I find myself continuing to grow too as I evolve since graduate school. So it's nice to see how we are in these different trajectories. Anyway, I think with that, I'll close. And I think you froze just a second there. And thank you again for the time you spent talking with me. Really appreciate you taking this time out to share your perspective. And I hope folks who view this video check out your work, both past work, articles, and books. The 2004 Women, Ideology, and Violence, and the 2009 Toward More Inclusive, Ancient Laws and Contemporary Controversies. And then also keep an eye out for your forthcoming work, which I also look forward to seeing on Crying Out to the Lord. Thank you again.
All right, thank you so much.